I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Phil Drew. He's going to talk about maritime law. You saw Phil's bio earlier, but I'd like to say on a personal note, I've known Dr. Drew for almost 4 decades now, and followed with great interest his career in the military and post-military career, a man of many accomplishments, although I did not realize that maritime law was one of them until today. So without further ado, Dr. Drew.
Thanks, Howard. Pardon me. Sorry, for those of you who didn't get that, Howard and I used to belong to the same military regiment. One of our mottos was never pass a fault. So anyway, my name is Phillip Drew, and I'm delighted to be here today. I'd like to thank Canadian Red Cross, Center for International Defense Policy, Canadian Forces Military Law Center, and the Faculty of Law for making this opportunity possible. Michael, thanks to you, especially back there in the corner, for putting up with me for the planning of this thing, and then for me not getting my lecture into you until last night around 10 o'clock. I was supposed to have had it in much earlier, but work got in the way. I would like to say that the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Colleen Flood, wanted to be here today, but she's now out of town on business, and she can't make it. Finally, I would also like to acknowledge Sophie, General Watkin, colleagues and friends, and thank you all for inviting me to participate as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about maritime confrontations in the South China Sea. When I originally said I was going to do this, I said, okay, I will do South China Sea, and then I will do a thing on Taiwan, particularly with respect to the legality of blockading Taiwan. Then I looked at how much time I had and how many slides that would take, and I usually use about 3 minutes per slide, and I had about 40 slides. So I said, no, this isn't going to work. So we're going to just talk about confrontations in the South China Sea and what's going on down in that part of the world. As we are focused on Israel and Gaza, and when we're not looking at that, we're generally looking at the Ukraine. There's an awful lot going on in the South China Sea, much of which evades our attention. There we go. So this morning I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to give a quick primer on maritime law. In order to understand what's going on in the South China Sea, we first need to understand some of the parameters of the law of the sea and the law of the sea convention. That places us in the context to be able to look at what is going on in that region and understand why it's so contentious. So we'll go through that, not too quickly, but it will be a very, very short primer on the law of the sea. Second part, we'll talk about the disputes in the South China Sea. I'll orient you to that region, introduce you to some of the issues, and then we'll move into the legal issues respecting maritime law, then the use ad bellum and the use in bello. So it's not just about humanitarian law, it's going to incorporate several areas of law. Yeah, it was. So we're going to do a quick law of the sea primer as I noted. For those of you who are familiar with the law of the sea, I'll ask you just to bear with me for a couple of minutes. For those of you who have not done law of the sea, please pay attention because I'm going to talk to you about zone. And that's what's really particularly important in today's piece that I'm going to do. So we are looking at a picture that tells us how to delineate maritime zones. We don't have a pointer, right?
There is on the past, but it's...
Oh, there we go. Okay. So This map shows us a perspective where we're looking from the mainland out towards sea. And there, along the mainland, there are things that we call baselines. We're not worrying too much about baselines today. It's too hard to cover in a couple of minutes. We're just going to pretend that this is the shoreline. The first 12 miles out to sea is called the territorial sea. All right? And in that 12 miles, it is essentially an area that the coastal state can exercise almost complete jurisdiction, or where it can exercise almost complete jurisdiction. Outside of that 12 miles, for the next 12 miles, is called the contiguous zone. We're not going to worry about the contiguous zone because it really has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today. We're going to worry about first the territorial sea, and then everything outside of it, okay? Everything outside of the territorial sea is classified as international waters. So the next thing we want to look at is 200 miles from the shoreline is what we call the exclusive economic zone. And in that zone, states have the right to, for exclusive use of natural resources, marine resources and underground resources in particular. So again, big one for us is territorial sea and then the exclusive economic zone. Come back to those in a little bit more detail in just a minute. As I said, it's a very quick primer on maritime. Okay, so as I said, the territorial sea stretches out 12 miles from the shore. And in that area, a state can exercise almost complete jurisdiction, subject to the flag state rule, which says that something that happens on board a ship and doesn't affect the coastal state stays on board that ship. So if there's a murder on the ship, let's say there's a Panamanian ship going in, or in Canadian waters, if there's a murder on that ship, it doesn't affect the coastal state, then it's the issue of the flag state. In that zone, flag or the coastal state gets to authorize ships to come in, to stay, to go out. There is a thing called innocent passage. All vessels are permitted to conduct innocent passage through territorial waters, subject to a couple of rules. The one thing the states cannot do is exercise civil jurisdiction on vessels in their territorial waters. So you can't conduct a lawsuit against people on a ship in the waters. Here we go. So we go from territorial waters where states can exercise almost exclusive jurisdiction to the exclusive economic zone. The exclusive economic zone is a huge area. When you think about the land or the territory or the shoreline of Canada, 288,000 miles, and you extend that out 200 miles, and do the math. I can't even do that math, I'm a lawyer. That's a lot of area under Canadian jurisdiction for minerals, fish, etc. Right? And again, country that has, or within a country's EEZ, a coastal state has the exclusive jurisdiction of fishing and mineral exploration, etc. Importantly, the only country that can build artificial installations in an EEZ is the coastal state. So, for example, if the United States wanted to build an island off Canada in our exclusive economic zone, they wouldn't be allowed. Okay, it's prohibited. There are several principles of maritime law that we all get to know as maritime lawyers. But we're not going to worry about the last few because flag state jurisdiction, immunity of warships, and the duty to cooperate in the repression of piracy really don't deal or really don't affect what I'm going to talk to you about today. Instead, I'd like to focus on respect for maritime boundaries and sovereignty. And as I noted, those boundaries are set out in the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea and the freedom of the high seas. So on the high seas, all vessels, and when we're talking about high seas, it means international waters in this case. I gave you a definition of high seas earlier on, which was outside the exclusive economic zone, but through the operation of UNCLOS, high seas for the purposes of navigation are anything outside the territorial seas of another state. So freedom of navigation means freedom of overflight, freedom to lay submarine cables, freedom to construct artificial islands and other installations. So when you are in the high seas, but then again, we're going to talk about anything outside the exclusive economic zone, you can build an artificial installation out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for example, if you can figure out how to do that in 14,000 feet of water. So again, artificial installations, you can build them outside of somebody else's exclusive economic zone, but not within. Thank you. Okay. An important concept when we're talking about South China Sea is the difference as well between rocks and islands. So an island is, in the law of the sea, a piece of land that is above the high water mark at high tide and can sustain human life. A rock is something that is above the water mark at high tide or above the waterline at high tide, but cannot sustain human life. A very important difference between them is that while a rock has a territorial sea, so you can draw a 12-mile line around a rock, it doesn't have an exclusive economic zone, but an island does. So an island, you have your territorial sea around your island, which is 12 miles, and then another 188 miles out is the tip of your exclusive economic zone. So if you've got an island in the middle of the ocean, that island has a 200-mile circle around it where you have exclusive rights over all the minerals, fish, etc. in that area. That's an island because there's houses on it. It's inhabited. It's a really good way to figure out whether it can sustain human life. Can you switch to that? All right. So with those concepts in mind, and I'm sorry this was a really quick primer on the law of the sea, we're going to talk about this area here, which takes up a tremendous amount of sea space. is called the South China Sea. And as you'll see this will work. There we go. We have states of China, Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan, if it's a state, Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia, that all are covered by this area called the South China Sea. Next one, please. I'll give a short introduction because they can do a better job than I can on the South China Sea dispute, just to put it into context.
This week on SNG Explains, we will look into the South China Sea dispute. So what is the South China Sea dispute? The South China Sea, that spans over 1.4 million square miles, is home to one of the busiest shipping routes and houses a wealth of marine life, fisheries in particular. It is also the scene of some of the bitter territorial conflicts, with competing claims made by littoral states such as Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, vis-a-vis Big Brother China, which is the dominant player in the region. The South China Sea has over 250 land features. The disputable ones include the Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, the Pratas Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and Macclesfield Bank. The Paracel Islands, which are under Chinese control, are claimed by Vietnam. China controls Scarborough Shoal, which is contested by the Philippines, among others. The Pratas Islands are under Taiwanese control, despite protests from China and the Philippines. The dispersed Spratly Islands are claimed by most of the littoral states and China. The contention over the territorial claim in the South China Sea dates back to the mid-20th century, when China's nationalist Kuomintang government came out with a map depicting an 11-dash line, later modified to a 9-dash line, claiming the whole of the Paracels, Pratas, and the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea after the Japanese defeat in the Second World War. In 2016, a tribunal set up under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas ruled that there was no evidence that China had exercised exclusive control over the waters and resources of the South China Sea, and therefore had no legal basis to claim historic rights to areas within the so-called 9-dash line. The United States estimates that there are 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas beneath the South China Sea. The water body is also a key trade route for China, including its energy imports from West Asia. To understand the East China Sea dispute, watch the first part of this series on SNG Explains. Stay tuned for more on Strat News Global.
All right, so we see the Chinese position written on the left of the slide with respect to the 9-dash line. The International Tribunal that decided on, or in 2016, that the 9-dash line was not a valid demarcation of Chinese sovereignty in the area was ignored by China. China said it does not recognize the arbitration and will not abide by its ruling. So we have this situation in the area. I need my little pointer here. So remember what I said about the exclusive economic zone, 200 miles from shore, right? So if we take a look at this line here, this is the exclusive economic zone for China. This area here would be the exclusive economic zone for the Philippines. This is the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia. There's a little country that starts with B here, and I forget its name, but that's their exclusive economic zone. Here's the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam. So within these zones here, the coastal states should be able to exercise their rights for mineral extraction, for fishing, etc. This area in here is what we would call truly high seas because it falls outside of the exclusive economic zones of any country there. And I'm at this point in time, I'm only talking about the large countries. I'm not talking about the islands. The Chinese 9-dash line is now a 10-dash line because they now say that Taiwan is theirs too. So that area there is the area that China claimed essentially as its exclusive economic zone. So in that area, China says that all rights to minerals, fishing, etc., belong to us. We are the only country that is allowed to create artificial installations as well. So these islands become incredibly important. Some of them are rocks. Remember, rocks only have a territorial sea. They don't have any EZ, but some of them are islands. So when we find actual islands in this area, we have to take a look at what the exclusive economic zones are of those islands. And when they're overlapping, some exclusive economic zones might only be a couple of miles because we use an equidistance calculation for determining overlapping exclusive economic zones. North Sea fisheries, for those of you who are in public international law. So when we take a look at it militarily, the Chinese are doing essentially two things by creating the 9-dash line. The first 9-dash line, if we take a look at it, has a very, very strategic implication for China because this area out to here off the Chinese coast can be covered by Chinese aircraft, by Chinese fighter aircraft. And when they are able to control islands in this area down here, again, they can push their first line of defense out to this area. Chinese are also now starting to make claims of islands and other features out to this area. And if we look just over here, we have Guam, we've got the Marshall Islands, etc. So there are a chain of islands that go down this way, and this would be seen as China's essentially outer defense region. So in the region, I will show you some pictures of some islands or rocks that have been converted into what the Chinese claim as islands now in the area. But some of the activities that we see going on violate international navigation standards and rules. But most of them are to block replenishment vessels from either Vietnam or the Philippines from reaching their claimed rocks or islands in the region, especially ones that China wants to control. So in this case, you'll see a Philippines Coast Guard ship again going, there we go, straight up against a Chinese Coast Guard vessel. The Chinese Coast Guard vessel is blocking it from getting to the resupply area. And same here. These are when you're sailing that close to other vessels, that's a really unsafe thing to do at sea. Bumping operations. You'll see that the Chinese Coast Guard vessel here actually has a bumper built onto the front of it to bump other vessels with, and using lasers to either blind or warn people away from region. One of the main concerns recently has been the growth of the Chinese naval militia. And essentially, any Chinese fishing vessel that wants to operate in the South China Sea has been incorporated into the Chinese maritime militia. Now, we say, so what? They're crewed sometimes by professional military personnel. Some of them are are legitimate fishing boats that actually do fishing. Some of them have never fished in their whole lives as boats. They are vessels that have been incorporated into the more or less the Chinese military system. So what actors in the region are seeing is that when the Chinese PLA Navy is going to show up, the first thing that shows up is the fishing boats, followed by Chinese Coast Guard, and sometimes, but not very often, the Chinese Navy will come into play as well. So in most countries, fishing boats are fishing boats, and fishing boats actually receive some protection under maritime law. Fishing boats that are actively going about their fishing business are not to be bothered in a maritime armed conflict. When you change the nature of that vessel, it changes the whole concept of what is a legitimate fishing vessel for the purposes of targeting in armed conflict. One of the activities that is particularly dangerous is the activity of swarming. And in this case, you'll see a number of fishing vessels surrounding a Philippines Coast Guard vessel, with a Chinese Coast Guard vessel sailing incredibly close behind. And what they're doing is they're blocking the Chinese Coast Guard vessel from getting to one of the rocks or islands that is inhabited by, they'll put an outpost. The Philippines will put outposts out on rocks and islands. One of them is actually on an old destroyer that has been grounded for the last 40 years. And they put 4 or 5 people in there. I don't know how they survive, but they do need to be resupplied. So in this case, we're seeing the swarming of the Coast Guard vessel to keep it from getting to that island. Now, not only are these breaches of navigation rules, we have to ask, okay, what are they doing? Are they using force? Is this a use of military force, even though there are no military vessels included? Is this a use of military force to stop a country from engaging in its own sovereign operations to resupply its people somewhere? So when we're looking at the issue of the use in bellum, we have to, or excuse me, you said bellow, we have to look at attribution. Okay, what is the flag state of these vessels? It's Chinese. But what is the relation between that vessel and the Chinese government, for example? Is that vessel a fishing vessel? Or is it a vessel that is an auxiliary? And if that vessel does something like, for example, ram a Chinese or a Philippine or a Vietnamese vessel and that vessel sinks, is that an act of force from the state of China? So when we're looking at a use of force, we're also looking at how much force is required for it to be considered a use of force in the jus ad bellum. Okay. Dangerous maneuvers. Sorry about the spelling of maneuvers. I just noticed that as I was looking at my slides before the presentation this morning. Probably not. Ramming. Well, ramming can sink a ship. So if you've got a vessel, particularly if it's a Philippine state vessel, it's one thing if it's a fishing vessel on another fishing vessel. But if the Philippines has a Coast Guard vessel that gets rammed or bumped by another vessel, even bumping can cause extreme damage to a vessel. Does that constitute a use of force? And what if that vessel sinks and people die? Vice versa. What if the Philippines bumps one of the Chinese fishing vessels, but the Chinese fishing vessel is actually a military auxiliary? Is that a use of force in jus ad bellum? At what point, in other words, may a conflict begin because of something that happens on the South China Sea? And this stuff is happening every day. Additionally, unsafe aerial intercepts. I was going to put up a video showing Chinese intercept of a Canadian ship, or correction, Canadian aircraft last month. There are rules about how close you can fly to other airplanes and what's safe and what's not. And the approaches that are occurring in this region right now, aerial approaches, are definitely not safe. And in one of the cases, the Chinese fighter jet flew by the Canadian Maritime Patrol airplane, and you could see the Canadian Maritime Patrol airplane being like bumped around by the wash coming off the jet engines because they blew afterburners right in front of them. So again, what happens if that Canadian airplane full of Canadians is damaged to the extent that it crashes as a result of something like that? Or the Americans. Howard. Okay, thank you. And what would be a reasonable and proportionate response in such cases? Getting into the point where we say, okay, something has happened here. This has gone too far. And all of a sudden, there is use of force between the states. We have vessels that may or may not be fishing vessels. They may or may not be Chinese auxiliaries. What is the status of those vessels? Becomes really, really important in the maritime context, because there is a requirement of distinction between civilian and military naval vessels and auxiliaries. But that distinction goes only to the vessel. If the vessel is deemed an enemy, then that vessel can be sunk. And it doesn't matter who's on the vessel, whether there are civilians or not. That you worry about under Geneva Convention 2. So if the vessel is deemed to be military and most of the people on board it are fishermen, then they are on a vessel that can be targeted. What is the status of the Chinese mariners if they are captured? Are they true fishermen, or are they members of the Chinese maritime militia? It's going to make a difference as to how they're treated in the context of prisoner of war status, for example. So these are important issues to understand when we're looking at how the law would operate in this region, particularly when we are in ad bellum and just as we're into in bello as well. You know, can we just target all the fishing vessels that have a Chinese flag on them? Because remember, under the targeting rules, we are, if there is a doubt as to the status of somebody or something as to whether or not it's a military objective, you take the cautious approach, and you must, if you don't know for sure, then you don't attack it. So, Howard's telling me that I've got almost no time left. And that's because I'm at the end of my presentation. How do you like that for time, and Howard?
Well, that was a lot of information to pack in a very short time, and I can understand why you ran out of time as you were giving the presentation. So we have time. We will take a question. Does anybody have a question?
Sir.
Yeah, I just had a question. So we've heard that with the conflict in Ukraine, there have been sort of an increasingly confrontational approach with Chinese policy to Taiwan. I was wondering if, there's any sort of analogous changes in the policy to the South China Sea, and, what your perspective on that would be.
There's so much going on in the South China Sea right now with respect to island building. And a slide that I should have put in and I didn't, shows the difference between some of the rocks that we talked about earlier that have been converted into what the Chinese now call islands. So they've taken a small rock, they've conducted dredging operations in the area, and they have created great big spaces where they can actually land fighter jets and stuff. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing this in international law in your own exclusive economic zone. But they're doing it in areas that are either in the exclusive economic zone of other countries or in contested areas. But when we look at the Chinese position on the South China Sea, they say it's all ours. We're not going to pay attention to the International Tribunal's ruling. It's all ours, so we can do with it what we want. And by the way, when we do have an island, we've just created this island, we're going to enforce a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around that island, which was a rock like 4 months ago. So that activity is a violation of the law of armed conflict. If an area is in somebody else's EEZ, or it is a contentious area, something that has not been settled yet in international law, you don't build on it. It's not yours. You can only build in your territory or in your own exclusive economic zone. The Philippines does have similar islands, but they've built them within their own exclusive economic zone. Again, nothing stops anybody from creating installations in their own area.
Dr. Drew, thank you very much for putting some light on what to me was an opaque area of friction. On behalf of the audience, thank you.
Thank you, Hart.
We'll take a 15-minute break.